The wind had found every crack in the den walls by the time Mara pulled the last pup against her chest, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only to those who have run out of options, that she was the only warm thing left in the world. 7 of them. 6 boys and the small girl they called Wren, because she was the smallest and made sounds like a bird when she slept. Little soft exhales that Mara had learned to listen for through the long nights, checking without waking. They were not her pups. That was what the other Omegas had whispered about her after she gathered them the unmated female who had no business taking in another wolf's children, who had no bond claim on any of them, whose arms were full of pups that belonged by the cold arithmetic of pack law to no one. The Alpha King's brother had died in the autumn. His mate had died in the birthing of the last 2. The pups had been distributed among the pack households like debts to be managed, and one by one, as the blizzard descended and the food stores shrank and fear made people cruel and small, they had been returned to the communal den with nothing but thin blankets and the smell of other people's reluctance still clinging to their fur. Mara had not chosen this. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. In the cold and the dark, with 7 small bodies arranged against her like spokes from a wheel, and the wind tearing itself apart against the stone walls outside. She had not chosen this any more than she had chosen the mark that sat at the base of her throat, the incomplete mate mark that had appeared 3 years ago on a night she did not speak about. A ghost burn from a bond that had never been claimed, left on her skin like a sentence without a verb. The pack knew about the mark. They pitied her for it, the way they pitied all half-claimed things. An Omega touched by a bond that had been refused. It was not precisely rare in Stonewolf Dominion, but it was shameful, and Mara wore the shame quietly, the way she wore everything, without complaint, without looking up when the pack elders passed, without asking for anything that she had not already learned she would not receive. The fire was dying. She had known it would. The wood was wet, most of it, dragged in before the blizzard sealed the den entrance, and it burned reluctant and slow, more smoke than warmth. And she had been feeding it in careful increments for the past 4 hours, rationing what was left the way she rationed everything. The pup against her right arm, Cade, the eldest, 7 years old and already trying to be brave in the exhausting way that very young children become brave when they have had no one to be brave for them, shifted in his sleep and made a sound that was not quite a whimper. She pressed her cheek to the top of his head. He smelled of wood smoke and cold and something sweet beneath it. The warm animal scent that pups carried before the world taught them to be ashamed of it. She could feel her own temperature dropping at the edges. Her fingers, even pressed against Cade's back, were stiffening at the knuckle. An Omega's body ran cooler than a Dominant's, always had. It was one of the many small disadvantages of her designation that she had catalogued over her 26 years and learned to work around. Though working around a blizzard of this scale was a different kind of mathematics entirely. She had shifted twice in the past hour, letting the wolf warmth bleed into the pile of sleeping children before pulling back to her human form so she could use her hands, could tend the fire, could count the bodies and reassure herself they were all breathing. Outside, the storm screamed. She did not let herself think about him. That was the discipline she had built over 3 years, brick by patient brick. Aldrich, Alpha King of Stonewolf Dominion, ruler of these high passes and the frozen lowlands beyond them, the man whose bond mark sat half-formed at the base of her throat because he had felt the pull between them on the night of the blood moon ceremony and had turned away from it the way a man turns away from something that offends. Him. She had watched him do it. That was the worst part, she thought, in the abstract way she permitted herself to think about it on nights when the cold made abstract thought easier than feeling. She had been standing in the great hall in her Omega's gray, invisible as all Omegas were at formal ceremonies, and she had felt the bond pull like a hand closing around her heart. And she had looked up she had not been able not to, and she had found him already looking at her across the crowd of assembled wolves. For one moment, that was all she permitted herself to remember. One moment of his dark eyes on her face, the expression in them too complex to name, too brief to hold, and then he had looked away, and spoken to his second and left the hall, and the bond had not completed, and Mara had stood in her gray and felt the mark burn itself into her skin anyway, a wound from something that had refused to be a gift. 3 years. She did not think about him. She had the pups now, against all practical logic, and the fire, and the blizzard, and that was enough to occupy the full territory of her attention. Wren made her bird sound, the tiny exhale. Mara adjusted her arm around the girl's small shoulders and felt the ache in her bones that was cold and hunger and exhaustion blurring together at the edges. She would keep them alive until morning. That was all, just morning. The fire sank another degree toward darkness. She had found the first two, the twins, Birch and Reed, on the morning the blizzard began, crouched in the lee of the pack granary with their paws tucked under them and their amber eyes wide with the particular stunned expression of children who have been waiting so long for someone to come that they have stopped believing. Anyone will. She had been returning from the water well, one of the last Omegas still doing communal work while the rest of the pack retreated to their household dens to wait out the storm. She had stopped, and they had stared at her, and she had made the calculation that would define the next 72 hours of her life in approximately 4 seconds. The granary had a lock she did not have a key to. The communal den was 200 yards north. She was an unmated Omega with no standing to commandeer pack resources, no rank to demand shelter or food or fire tending from anyone. She had picked up the twins and carried them to the communal den and gone back out into the beginning of the blizzard for wood. The others had come in pieces. Cade had arrived on his own in the first night, old enough to walk, proud enough not to want her to carry him, his jaw set in a way that made her chest hurt. The younger two, Finn and Soren, had been delivered by an older pack member whose name Mara did not know, an elder woman who had knocked on the communal den door, pressed the children inside without ceremony, and disappeared back into the white. And Mara had understood that this was not cruelty exactly, only the arithmetic of survival, the calculation that said these pups were not blood and the food would not stretch. Little Fen had been sleeping near the door when she arrived, already half cold, curled around himself with his tail over his nose, and she had gathered him without thinking, tucked him into the hollow of her body, and pressed warmth back into him for an hour before he stopped shaking. And Wren she had gone out into the storm for, because someone had mentioned, in the way of a thing said sideways, that the girl pup had been left in the watchtower outbuilding, which was stone and dark and had no fire. She did not like to think about the watchtower, the cold of it, Wren's stillness when she found her, the 7 minutes it had taken, pressed against the wall in her wolf form with the girl tucked against her belly, before she felt the first flutter of returning warmth. 7 pups. An unmated Omega with no claim on any of them, in a dying den in a 3-day blizzard, with a fire that was running out of reasons to keep burning. She shifted again, pressing the wolf warmth out through her skin into the sleeping pile, and tried not to count how many hours remained until dawn. Cade woke sometime in the deep middle of the night, the hour that has no name, that belongs entirely to dread, and found her awake, as she always was. "You're not sleeping," he said. His voice was gravelly with cold. "I sleep later," she told him. It was not precisely a lie. She did, sometimes, sleep later. "The fire's almost out." "I know, there's a little wood left." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the embers with the serious expression that was too old for his face. Then, "Are we going to be all right?" She did not lie to children. It was one of the few moral positions she held with any rigidity. But she also understood that there are different kinds of truth, and the one that Cade needed in this moment was the kind that steadied the hands, rather than the kind that named the danger precisely. "I'm going to keep you warm," she said. "That's what I know how to do." He considered this with the gravity of someone who had already learned the difference between a promise and an answer. Then he turned and pressed himself back against her side, his small fist curling into the fabric of her tunic, and was asleep again within minutes. She did not let the things she felt in her chest become anything named. She had learned that, too. The fire went out at what she estimated was 2 hours before dawn. She shifted fully then, not the partial shift she'd been using, which preserved her human hands and voice, and let her tend the pups individually, but the full deep shift, the wolf entire, which generated heat from the bones outward, in a way that the partial form did not. It cost more. She had not eaten since the previous morning, and the shift pulled from reserves she could feel thinning, muscle, and stored warmth, and the last of what she had held back for herself. She arranged herself around the children like a wall in a furnace. At once her body curved in the great half-circle of the wolf, Pups tucked against her belly and sides and the deep, warm fur of her chest. And she rested her head on her forepaws and watched the cold gray of the den and the dark beyond the sealed entrance, and the slow, even rise and fall of 7 small chests. This was the thing about being an Omega that the rest of the pack had gotten wrong, she thought, in the particular Clearwater way she thought when the wolf was fully present. They thought Omega meant lesser. They thought the designation meant smaller desire, smaller capacity, smaller everything. They had never asked what it was like to want to keep something safe with the whole of your body, every resource, down to the marrow. They had never asked what it was like to run cooler and still choose to be the warmth. She did not think about Aldrich. She listened to Wren's bird sound and counted 7 breaths and did not think about him at all. The blizzard broke at first light. She heard it happen, the particular change in the pitch of the wind from its 3-day howl to something that was still cold and still present but no longer furious. The storm releasing its grip on the pass the way a hand releases something it has held too long. Light, thin, and gray-white began to seep under the door gap, and she raised her head from her paws and felt the exhaustion in every part of her, and assessed it the way she assessed everything, clinically and without drama. She was cold, she was hungry, her stores were deeply depleted from the night of full shift. She was alive, and the pups were alive, and those were the 2 columns of the balance, and the rest could wait. She shifted back to human and pulled the thin blankets around the sleeping pile with hands that shook slightly and told herself it was cold rather than anything else. Cade was the first to wake, as usual, and he looked at her with those 2 old eyes, and she thought she saw something that might have been relief move through them, quickly contained. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said back. She was rebuilding the fire with the last of the dry wood she had stored in the corner small sticks, barely enough, but enough for now when she heard footsteps in the snow outside the den. Not one set. Many. Her head came up. The wolf heard it before her human ears fully processed it. The rhythm of approach, the weight of adult bodies in deep snow, the purposeful cadence that was not the stumbling of someone caught out in a storm, but the deliberate movement of a group that knows where it is going. And underneath it, running beneath the surface of the packed snow and the cold air, a scent she had forbidden herself to recognize for 3 years. Dark pine, riverstone, the deep mineral cold of high altitude, the particular compound of dominant alpha that no amount of discipline could make her body pretend was unfamiliar. She was on her feet before she chose to stand. The den door opened, and the cold came through first, and then the light, and then Aldrich. He was taller than she remembered, which was not possible, and yet was true in the way of things seen again after an absence. He filled the doorframe the way a mountain fills a valley, not by being larger than the space, but by making the space aware of itself. He wore trail furs over his pack leathers, dusted with snow that had not entirely melted, despite what must have been a hard push through the end of the blizzard, and his dark hair was wet at the temples, and his jaw was tight in the way it got when he was managing something difficult by force of will. Behind him she could see 2 of his guard wolves and 2 others she did not recognize, carrying packs that clinked with the sound of food stores and firewood. He stopped when he saw her. She had thought about this moment in the weak and unguarded way of 3 a.m. thinking when she could not fully police herself. She had imagined it in several versions. In none of them had she looked like this barefoot on a cold stone floor, hair loose and unwashed, wearing the tunic she had shifted out of and back into enough times it was nearly transparent at the elbows, with 7 pups asleep in a pile behind her, and exhaustion visible in every line of her body. She had imagined, in the worst of the versions, having the composure to look at him with nothing in her face. She did not have composure. She was too empty for it. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the mark at the base of her throat burned. It had not done that in 3 years. A ghost burn, now and then, in moments she had attributed to cold or anxiety, or the particular ache of unfulfilled things. But this was different. This was the full burn, the first night burn, immediate and consuming and entirely outside her control. She watched his eyes drop to her throat and knew he could see it. Wolves saw these things, the mark made visible by its own heat, a small coal burning at the base of a pale throat. His expression did not change. He was very good at that. It was one of the things she had catalogued about him in the one moment she had permitted herself to study him, before she built the discipline. He controlled his face the way he controlled his territory completely, and as though the effort cost him nothing. "Mara," he said. Her name in his mouth was something she did not have a category for. She filed it away to not think about later. "Alpha King," she said, and her voice was level, and she was obscurely proud of that. His gaze moved past her to the sleeping pile of pups. Something shifted in his face. Then, not the public expression, but something underneath it. Something that crossed his features too quickly for her to read, before it was contained again. He looked at the arrangement of them, the way they were bundled in every blanket she had, the way she had arranged them in a radiating pattern against the den wall to share warmth, the way little Wren was curled at the center of the pile, the way birds curl, tight and small and protected. "7, he said. "7, she confirmed. "All of them. All of them." The guard wolves behind him were very still. She was aware of them with the peripheral attention of an Omega who had learned to be aware of dominant wolves in her space, tracking for threat, calibrating for safety. They were not threatening. They were watching the exchange between their king and the barefoot Omega, with an attention that was not quite neutral, and she did not permit herself to care about that. Aldrich took 2 steps into the den. He moved carefully, the way large predators move in small spaces, which was not about hesitation, but about precision. He crouched at the edge of the sleeping pile and looked at the pups for a long moment at Cade, who had woken and was watching him with wide, dark eyes, at the twins, still sleeping, at Wren in the center with her small hands pressed together under her chin. "My brother's children," he said. It was not quite addressed to her. It was the kind of statement that is made to the air, to acknowledge something out loud that might otherwise stay too heavy. "Yes," she said. He straightened. When he looked at her again, there was something different in the look. She could not name it. She had very carefully not assembled the vocabulary to name the things his face did. "How long?" he asked. 3 days, she said. "Since the storm began." "Alone?" "Yes." "The fire went out." She did not ask how he knew. He was Alpha. He had walked into the den and read it the way Alphas read their territory, tracking what was wrong by the absence of what should be right. "A few hours before dawn," she said. "I shifted. It was adequate." He repeated the word quietly, in a tone she could not interpret. "Adequate." "They're all alive," she said, and there was something in her own voice then that she had not intended to put there. Not defensiveness, not quite, but the stripped-down fact of it, offered like an account rendered. She had been alone and without resources in a blizzard for 3 days, with 7 pups that were not hers, and she had kept them alive, and that was the sum of the balance, and she was not going to apologize for the method. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she had to concentrate on keeping her breathing even, on not letting the marks burn show in her face, long enough that the guard wolves behind him exchanged a glance she caught in her periphery. "You should have sent word," he said. She felt something move in her chest, sharp and cold and old. The thing she kept in the locked room where she stored the things that were true but not useful. She looked at him steadily. "To whom?" she said. The question hung between them. She watched him understand what she was saying. She watched the understanding arrive in his face, the way weather arrives, the small changes before the larger one, the quality of light shifting before the rain. He knew what she was, he knew what she was not. He knew the shape of her standing in the pack and the absence of anyone who was responsible for her, the particular silence around an Omega who had been half-claimed and then released back into no woman's land, belonging to no household and no designations hierarchy, invisible at formal ceremonies and present at communal labor, with no one to send word to and no expectation that the word would reach someone who would come. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. She was past the resources required for looking away. "To me," he said. She felt the words arrive somewhere below her ribs. "You were not here," she said. "You have been at the eastern stronghold since the autumn equinox." "I came back." "You came back this morning," she said, "when the storm broke." She did not say, "You did not come back in the autumn, when your brother died and his children were distributed like debts." She did not say, "You did not come back on the night of the blood moon 3 years ago, when you walked away from something that burned itself into my skin anyway." She was not a woman who said things like that. She was a woman who kept her balance in cold dens with 7 sleeping children and fires that were running out of wood, and she did so by keeping the ledger of unsaid things carefully closed. But he heard it anyway. She saw it in his face, that thing again, the one she did not have vocabulary for, moving underneath the controlled surface of his expression, like something large moving beneath ice. One of the guard wolves cleared his throat. It was a delicate sound, cautiously timed. Aldrich did not look at him. He was still looking at Mara. "Unpack the stores," he said, without turning. "Set a proper fire. Get food on." The guards moved into the den with the purposeful quiet of men who understand that they are peripheral to something larger. Mara heard them behind her, the sound of wood stacking, of pack fastenings, of the particular percussion of people making a space habitable with efficiency. Cade had sat up fully now and was watching the Alpha King with an expression that was equal parts wariness and the helpless fascination that very young wolves could not always suppress in the presence of a dominant. Aldrich looked at him, and something in his face eased very slightly, the way a knot eases one fiber at a time before it releases. "Cade," he said. The boy blinked. "You know my name." "You look like your father," Aldrich said, and the words were simple and true and contained everything they contained. And Mara watched the boy's chin wobble for exactly 1 second before he pulled it back under control with the heartbreaking efficiency of a child who has had a great deal of practice. "He showed me how to bank a fire," Cade said after a moment. "He showed me the same thing," Aldrich said, "when we were not much older than you." The twins were awake now, sitting up in the blanket pile and staring at the Alpha King, with the identical, wide-eyed expression of very young children, confronted with something enormous and uncertain. Finn and Soren were stirring. Fen had buried himself more deeply under a blanket and was pretending, with considerable commitment, to still be asleep. Wren, the smallest, the one she had gone into the storm for, opened her eyes the way she did everything quietly, without announcement, and looked around the den with the calm assessment of a child who has learned to wake in strange places and evaluate them before reacting. She looked at Mara first. Mara met her eyes and gave the small nod that had become their private language. "I am here. We are safe. You may breathe," and watched the girl's shoulders drop half an inch with the release of tension. Then Wren looked at Aldrich, and whatever she saw in his face must have seemed acceptable to her careful internal accounting, because she simply looked back at Mara and put her thumb in her mouth and closed her eyes again. Something moved in Aldrich's expression at that. Something Mara was not quick enough to prevent herself from seeing. The guards had the fire going now. She could feel the heat beginning to build, real heat, the kind that had weight to it, and her body responded to it the way bodies respond to relief after extended extremity, not with dramatics but with a deep trembling in the muscles. A gradual release of the clenched holding pattern she had maintained through the night. She locked her knees and did not let it show. He saw it anyway. "Sit down," he said, quietly. The way he said things, she had noticed. In the one moment she had allowed herself to notice. Not as commands, exactly, but as something heavier than requests. Things that expected to be heard. "I'm fine," she said. Mara, her name again, and something in the register of it this time that she did not know how to close a door against. "Sit down." She sat. Not because he was Alpha King, she told herself, with the stubbornness she had cultivated as one of the few possessions entirely her own, but because the fire was warm and she had been standing for a very long time, and her body had reached the point where it was going to win the argument with her pride regardless of her position on the matter. One of the guards brought her a cup, broth, from the smell of it, rich and fatty and hot, the kind that came from a pack kitchen that had resources she had not had access to in 3 days. She wrapped both hands around it and did not let herself close her eyes, which was an instinct she was not prepared to indulge in public. Aldrich crouched beside her, not in front of her, not above her, but beside her at her level, which was not the posture of an alpha king receiving a subordinate's report. She was aware of every inch of the distance between them and the heat coming off his body and the burn at her throat and the particular quality of attention he was paying her, which was the attention of someone who had decided to look at something they had been not looking at for a long time. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him. "Tell you what?" "How it happened. All of it. From the beginning." So she did. She told him about the morning the storm began, and the twins at the granary, and the calculation she had made in 4 seconds. She told him about Kate arriving proud and tight-jawed in the first night, and the elder woman who had delivered Finn and Soren without speaking. She told him about Fen and the hour of warming him back. She told him because he asked, and she had run out of reasons to manage what she offered, about the watchtower and Wren and the 7 minutes. She kept her voice level. She looked at the fire rather than at him while she spoke. It was easier. When she finished, there was a silence. "The watchtower," he said. His voice was different. She could not look at him to assess what the difference was. "You went out into the blizzard for a pup that was not yours." "She was cold," Mara said. "She was cold," he repeated, and something in the repetition was not mockery but the opposite of it. The registering of a thing said plainly that contains more than its plainness. "You were alone. You had no obligation, no rank, no claim." "She was cold," Mara said again. That was sufficient. Another silence. She could feel him looking at her profile, and she kept her eyes on the fire and drank the broth in small, steady sips and tried to remember that she was a woman who had built discipline out of worse materials than this. "I failed them," Aldrich said. She turned her head before she decided to. He was looking at the sleeping pups at Wren in the center of the pile, at Cade, who had accepted a piece of dried meat from one of the guards and was eating it with the controlled speed of a child, trying not to look hungry, and his face was doing the thing it had done earlier, the thing she did not have vocabulary for, except that she was beginning to assemble one despite herself. It was grief, she thought. And beneath grief, the specific kind of shame that belongs to someone who knows the shape of their own abdication. "You didn't know," she said. "I should have known." His jaw was tight. "They were Brennan's children. My blood. I left them with—" He stopped. She watched him stop, watched him choose the next thing carefully. "I trusted the pack to manage." "The pack managed," she said, "in the way that packs manage when resources are limited and obligation is diffuse." She was not defending the pack. She was naming something true because it seemed important that he understand the mechanism, not just the failure. "You are pack," he said. She looked at him directly then, because that statement required to be met directly. "I am an unmated omega, with no household and no bond claim," she said. "I am pack in the way that air is pack. Present, necessary for survival, not counted." The words landed. She watched them land. She had not said anything like that in 3 years. She had managed herself more carefully than this. But 3 days of cold and 2 hours without fire and 7 pups and the broth and the warmth and his knee 6 inches from hers had apparently depleted the reserve she used for careful management, and what was left underneath was only the thing that was true. He was very still beside her. The fire popped. One of the guards, she was dimly aware, had guided the older children to food, was breaking bread and apportioning it with a quiet efficiency that she noted and was grateful for. "Mara." His voice was low. She felt it more than heard it, felt it at the base of her throat where the mark was still burning. "Look at me." She looked at him. This close, in the firelight, she could see the exhaustion in him too, the shadow beneath his eyes, the slight hollowness at his jaw. He had pushed through the end of the blizzard to get here. She had not yet asked herself why. She was asking herself now. "How long has the mark burned?" he said. Her breath stopped. She could feel the heat of it at her throat, visible, unavoidable. She had known he could see it from the moment he walked in. She had been managing it the way she managed everything, treating it as information to work around rather than a fact to address. "Since you walked through the door," she said. She was past the resources required for anything other than honesty. Something crossed his face that was not the controlled public expression, and was not the grief she had named, and was not anything she had a word for yet. It was raw and specific, and it was aimed at her. "3 years ago," he said, in the Great Hall. "I know when it happened," she said. "I walked away from it." "I know that too." "Mara." "You don't need to explain it," she said, and her voice was steady, which was a minor miracle, she thought, considering everything. "You're Alpha King. You had a choice to make. You made it. The mark is mine to carry. I'm not. I haven't asked you for anything." "No," he said, "you haven't." And the way he said it, she thought, was not an accusation. It was something worse, recognition. She looked away. The fire. She would look at the fire. "That night," he said, "the blood moon." He paused. She heard him choose his words, the careful, deliberate choosing of a man who says few things and means most of them. "I felt the pull. I have felt it hundreds of times in my life, the false pulls, the pack bonds that feel like mate bonds in the high emotion of ceremony. I was experienced enough to know the difference, or I believed I was." She was very still. "I walked away because I believed I could not afford to be wrong," he said. "Because the Dominion was in the middle of the eastern border dispute, and my second had died 3 months before, and I had nothing to spare for something that I thought might be a misread." She could hear what this cost him. She was an Omega with no political standing and a great deal of experience observing the faces of people who were saying something they had never said out loud before. "I told myself I would come back to it," he said. "After the border was settled, I told myself I would look for you then." He stopped. The fire popped. The border took 14 months. 14 months. She had learned to live in her unmarked skin long before 14 months. She had learned to say good morning without feeling the ghost of something pulling at the base of her throat in approximately 10. "And then?" she said, because she needed to know, and because she could feel the shape of the rest of it, and needed him to say it rather than leave it to her imagination. "And then I was afraid," he said, simply, without apology, but without armor either, the way a man says something that he has decided deserves to be said plainly. "I had left it too long. The mark had set in you and I had not claimed it, and I knew what that said about me, what it meant, what you must have." He stopped again. "I didn't know how to come back from it." She was quiet for a long time. The guards were very busy with the children, very busily not present in any meaningful sense. "You are an Alpha King," she said at last. "You manage things. You make decisions with inadequate information and live with them. That is what your life is. You told me as much just now, the border dispute. 14 months, one decision on a blood moon night when you were stretched too thin. These are not," she pulled in a breath, "these are not the actions of a villain in a story, Aldrich. They are the actions of a man who was afraid and made choices, and then was afraid of the choices he had made." She had used his name. She was not sure when that had happened. He was looking at her with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, slowly, the way you read a language you learned in childhood and have not spoken in years. It was the expression of someone who had come expecting to account for something and had instead been handed something he had not expected. "You are explaining my failure to me," he said, with more generosity than I deserve. "I'm not being generous," she said. "I'm being accurate. There's a difference. The smallest of movements, not quite a smile, not quite. Something that lived in the same country." "In the watchtower," he said. "When you went out into the blizzard for Wren." She waited. "You had no reason to. No claim, no rank, no obligation." "I told you," she said. She was cold. "You do that," he said. "You do the thing that is needed because the thing is needed, and you don't ask whether you have the standing for it." He was looking at her very steadily. "I have been trying to understand how to lead a dominion for 11 years. The question I ask, the question my council asks, every time there is a decision, the first question always is, Who has the standing? Who has the rank? Who has the right? He paused. You went into a blizzard for a pup because she was cold, and that was sufficient. It is not the same thing, she said. Leading a dominion is not the same thing as keeping a child warm. Isn't it? He said. At the bottom of it. Isn't that the bottom of it? She looked at him. He looked back. Between them, the fire burned with the steady assurance of a fire that has enough wood, finally, that it does not need to be rationed. Wren made her bird sound in the sleeping pile, a small, quiet exhale, utterly trusting. Mara felt something shift in her chest, something she had kept locked and still for 3 years, and she thought about the brick wall she had built with such patience, and she thought about the discipline, and she thought about 7 pups alive in a den because she had decided that cold was a sufficient reason to act, and she decided, with the same simple clarity, that she was tired of rationing this too. You want to come back from it, she said. It was not a question. Yes, he said. No hesitation. The mark is already set, she said. In me. What is in me cannot be undone. I know. If you complete it, she said, you complete it. This is not something you can decide later, is an error in judgment and manage around. I know, he said again. She studied his face. She was very good, by now, at assessing honesty. She had spent 3 years developing the skill, among others. What she saw in his face was the particular quality of a man who has done his accounting and arrived at a number he is not going to argue with. The children, she said. My blood, he said. My responsibility. My failure and my repair, if you will help me. They're not a bargain, she said quickly. I want to be clear that I did not keep them alive as a... I know, he said, and the gentleness in it stopped her. I know that. That is not what I meant. He paused. I meant, they need a home that is not a communal den in a blizzard, and I have a home, and you are the only person who went out in a storm for them, and if you are willing... He paused again. If you are willing, all of that would be together. She looked at the sleeping pile, at Cade, who had finished his meat and was now sitting with his back against the den wall and his eyes on the fire, grave and serious and too old, at the twins in their heap, at Finn, who had given up pretending to sleep and was sitting up eating bread in small, precise bites, at Finn and Soren, who had fallen back asleep against each other's shoulders, at Wren, in the center of it all, her small hands pressed together, her breathing the quiet, even rhythm of a child who has decided she is safe. She looked at the mark she could not see, but could feel, burning at the base of her throat with the insistent warmth of something that had always known what it was, even when she had been working very hard not to. She looked at Aldrich. If I do this, she said, I need to say something first. Say it. I am an Omega, she said. I know what that means in Stonewolf Dominion. I know the hierarchy. I am not going to spend the next 20 years being invisible in the great hall in my gray and smiling when the council elders look through me. I am not good at invisible. I am not going to learn. She looked at him steadily. If you complete the mark, I am yours, but that means you are also mine. And I will not pretend that the arithmetic is only in one direction. The silence that followed was very brief. That is not invisible, he said. No, she agreed. Good, he said. She felt the word arrive somewhere that she had kept very carefully empty for 3 years. Something filled it not all at once, not dramatically, but the way warmth fills a room when you finally build a fire that is not being rationed, slowly, thoroughly, all the way to the corners. Cade, from across the den, was watching them with the too perceptive eyes of a child who has been paying attention to adult faces his entire short life and has become very good at reading what they do not say. He looked at Mara, and she gave him a small nod, a different nod than the one she gave Wren, less a reassurance than an acknowledgement, and he turned back to the fire with a gravity that might, she thought, contain the smallest seed of something less than gravity, if given time and warmth and enough wood for the fire. Aldrich reached across the space between them, and his fingers found the back of her hand where it rested on her knee. And he did not take her hand, did not grasp it with the certainty of claim, but rested his fingers there against her knuckles, a question at the exact edge of an answer. She turned her hand over. He pressed his palm against hers, and the mark at the base of her throat blazed not painful, not quite, but the opposite of the ghost burn, which was presence where there had been only absence, completion where there had been 3 years of open and aching incompleteness. She felt it move through her the way heat moves through cold hands, first at the surface, then deeper, then all the way down to the place below names. She did not close her eyes. She looked at the fire and she felt him beside her, and she heard 7 children breathing in the deep, even rhythm of safety, and the last of the blizzard sighed and released itself outside. And the morning came into the den, the way mornings come after hard nights, not announcing itself, not demanding gratitude, simply arriving and being undeniably, practically, thoroughly there. She was an omega. She had kept 7 pups alive in a 3-day blizzard with a dying fire and her own body heat, and the simple, intractable conviction that cold was sufficient reason to act. She had no rank, no household, no political standing, no claim on any of the children who were even now beginning to wake around her with the particular animal trust of things that have been kept safe and do not yet know to be surprised by it. She had a mark at her throat that had waited 3 years to be completed, and a hand holding hers that was warm and certain and no longer half-made, and 7 pups who were alive because she had gone out into the storm for them, and a man beside her who had finally, at first light, come back. That was the full accounting. That was the balance, every column of it. And it was enough, more than enough. It was the whole of the world she had built from the materials available to her, and she was not going to apologize for a single stone of it. Outside, the snow was still falling, lightly now, the soft, purposeless snow that follows a storm that has spent itself completely. It settled on the pass and the watchtower and the pack granary and the great road that led from the eastern stronghold back through the mountains to the Dominion's heart, and it covered everything equally. Old marks and new ones, the evidence of what had been survived and the first soft beginning of what came after. Wren opened her eyes. She looked at Mara. She looked at the Alpha King beside her, at the joined hands, at the mark burning its warm completion, at the base of Mara's throat. She looked back at Mara with the calm, thorough assessment she applied to everything, and apparently finding the sum of it acceptable, she removed her thumb from her mouth, yawned with her whole face, and held out her arms. Mara pulled her in with her free hand, and felt the girl's small body settle against her side with the absolute trusting weight of a child who has decided that this is where she belongs, and that was the end of the blizzard, and the beginning of everything else.